the sun in the stars tonight. So watch me bring the fire, set the night light. Shoes on, get up in the morning, cup of milk, let's rock and roll. Kink out, kick the drum, rolling on like a rolling stone. Sing song when I'm walking home, jump up to the top of the brown. Ding dong, call me on my phone, nice tea and I'll get my ping pong. This is dead heavy, can't hear the bass, boom, I'm ready. Life is sweet as honey, yeah, this beach shade like money. This go overload, I'm into that, I'm good to go, I'm diamond, you know I glow up.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's town hall. We're allowing everybody to come in, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos a nuestro foro comunitario. Vamos a comenzar momentáneamente. Estamos dejando a los participantes entrar. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. And we're waiting for our participants to come in and we'll get started shortly. Okay. So welcome everyone to Local District Central's Home of the Champions Asian American Voices event. We're very excited to have you here with us today. Before starting, I'd like to inform you that this town hall will be presented in English and will have simultaneous translation in Spanish and Korean. To listen to this presentation in Spanish or Korean, you would need to click on the language option on the world icon you see on your screen and will select Spanish or Korean to begin. Antes de comenzar, les informamos que este foro será presentado en inglés y tendremos traducción simultánea en español y coreano. Para escuchar, ya sea en español o en coreano, oprima el símbolo del mundo y podrá ver el icono que indica español o coreano en su pantalla para poder empezar.
안녕하세요. 오늘 웨비나는 한국어로 통역이 가능합니다. 한국어로 들으시고 싶은 분들은 이 아래 지구본 그림을 누르시면 한국어를 선택할 수 있습니다. 감사합니다.
Before we begin, I'd like to review some important points so that we all have an understanding on how to participate during today's session. During this town hall session, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists during the presentation. On your screen, you will see a Q&A icon and can type in your questions. At the conclusion of this presentation, we will have our panelists respond to as many questions that we can as time permits. Also, this session is being video recorded and will be shared on our community schools websites and our local district central website. Now we can get started. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mrs. Myrna Reynoso from our School Mental Health Department at Local District Central. Mrs. Reynoso.
Thank you so much, and good evening to everyone. Welcome for today's presentation. I wanted to take this opportunity as the School Mental Health Coordinator to share the resources that are available to everyone. As we're going through these very difficult and unusual times, it's okay to not be okay. There has been an increase in symptoms of depression and anxiety across the country, 30% increase in these having these symptoms. So we want to make sure that you are aware of what resources are available, and it's okay to ask for help. So we have LAUSD, the wellness hotline that's available Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and the number's on the slide, as well as a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hotline that the County Department of Mental Health provides. It's 1-800-854-7771, or you can also text if you're in a state of crisis to LA to the number 741-741. So thank you. Know that we're here to support you. And I'll pass it back to Ms. Areguin.
Good evening, local district central families, students, and community members. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to our We Stand Together Asian American Voices Town Hall discussion with an emphasis on Korean American communities. I'm Andre Spicer. I'm one of the administrators of instruction here at Local District Central. My counterpart, Mrs. Julie Gonzalez, and I are proud to serve you and your children. Tonight, it is our objective to highlight the historical experiences of the Korean American community within Los Angeles and beyond. We also would like to show our support and stand with our communities as allies, because we truly believe that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, to quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Currently, we are experiencing the disgusting and alarming rise in abuse and racist acts of violence that is permeated throughout our society, targeted against Asian citizens. We know that this negatively affects our students, as many of them may feel fear and discomfort for just being who they are. In Local District Central, we take pride in embracing all of the cultural assets and gifts of every culture and community, because we believe that makes us stronger. Now, I would like to give us an overview of our program tonight, and again, welcome you and thank you for joining us. So our agenda tonight is very simple. We're going to have none other than Dr. Ruth Chung from the University of Southern California give us a talk on the experiences, life experiences, and contributions of Korean Americans. We'll have a question and answer, and of course, our closing. Today is Mindful Monday, and we've heard from our wellness personnel that are explaining we have to be well. So we want to keep in mind that we're going to be mindful on Mondays. It's the ability to fully present in the moment. Next slide. Our 7 norms of collaboration, because champions were always working together, posing questions, pausing, presuming positive intentions, putting ideas on the table, providing data, paying attention to self and others, and paraphrasing. Then there's also Zoom norms. We want to make sure that we're on mute when we're not speaking. We're going to place our questions in the question and answer box. Be patient and flexible, as sometimes we know that there's technology issues via Zoom. Presume positive intentions, use your reaction symbols, your emojis, and most importantly, try to be present. We're an adaptive school district, so we would like to say we're always on a triple track agenda, meaning our learning tonight, of course, is for our adults that are here present, and then it will lead to others learning, and ultimately in our classrooms for the benefit of our students. Our instructional foci for 2020 and 2021 here in Local District Central, of course, is grounded in rigorous grade level, standards-based learning, engagement strategies for everyone that's in pre-kindergarten through our graduating seniors. Our equity lens, where we embrace all the populations at the margins, including English learners, students with IEPs, those of gender identity, and those that are unheard. This year's intentional focus was Black Students Matter. We see you, we hear you. And of course, the universal design for learning, where we want to make sure that all of our young people have access to a rigorous curriculum. Now, I would like to introduce our local district superintendent, Mrs. Frances Baez. She has dedicated herself to these issues of social justice and equity. And here in Local District Central, under her leadership, we ground our work in the equity lens, pushing to ensure that every student has the opportunity to excel. Mrs. Baez, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spicer. Good evening, Local District Central community. My name is Frances Baez, Superintendent in Local District Central, the home of the champions. Thank you for being with us today to learn about our Asian American community. Today, we are featuring our Korean American brothers and sisters. We will learn about their historical contributions, their equity journey, and ways we can become allies. I want to begin by stating that we are against acts of hate and violence targeted towards Asian American and Pacific Islander community. I thank Mr. Spicer, Dr. Bian Kitayama, and school communities and guest speaker, Dr. Ruth Chung, for sharing her expert voice on the topic. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the LA Unified board members who make this possible to create the climate and conditions for us to have these types of forums and establish this culture. It is my pleasure to introduce board member Dr. McKenna from Board District 1, who's here to deliver remarks. Dr. McKenna, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Superintendent Baez. And I appreciate, and also hello to my colleagues, my board member colleagues. And I think it's unfortunate that we have to express our solidarity with a community that we've always appreciated, the overall Asian community, in particular today, the Korean community, because of the horrendous things that have happened to them locally and nationally. I don't know who to blame this on. I could, but what is important is who will be responsible for responding to it. I think it is a national issue that arose because of the previous presidency. I take it personally because having been raised in legal and illegal segregation in the segregated South as a youth, all of my education was segregated in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I see this uprise of hatred towards anybody who is not of the majority race. And that is not new to me. And so I just want to say in a personal and in professional way, as a board member, we stand with you, as Dr. Andrea Spicer said, in solidarity, with or without all of this oppression that is going on and people being attacked, the cowardly acts. We are with you in schools, outside of schools, in your neighborhoods, in your communities. We pledge to you our support for your parents, for your children, for your communities, for our teachers who are of Asian background, and look to them to help us solve problems, hopefully before they arise. But thank you for allowing me this opening to, and I will be listening. I will come off the screen, but I will be listening very carefully to whatever is offered as suggestions and remedies, if there are some that we'd like to hear from, and I will try to attend the others as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Superintendent Baez. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McKenna. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Honorable Board Member Monica Garcia, representing Board District 2. Board Member Monica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Baez. Hello, friends in Local District Central. Annyeonghaseyo. I am here to lift my voice in solidarity with you and all who know that love and learning can overcome fear and hate. It is wrong to subject any person to violence because of their ethnic background. And I am grateful to my colleagues on the board, to our leaders at Local District Central, to the teachers and staff and leadership at our school sites. And I want to just say that it has been my privilege to represent Koreatown, Chinatown, Lincoln Heights, Little Tokyo, and I have been enriched by working in community with the diversity of Los Angeles. When we name schools for Young-Ok Kim and Charles Kim and know that Sammy Lee was, that these people are the LAUSD graduates that we celebrate. I just want us all to stand firm in celebrating and knowing who we are and that we stand together in good times and tough times. And indeed, if anyone needs help, the school district is here to help. As a Mexican-American, Chicana, Latina from East LA, I have experienced behavior that causes me anger. And all I want to say to you is that we need to find a way to not hurt ourselves in living in that anger, but stand in solidarity and knowing that together, indeed, we can move forward. So thank you for being here. I am with you and you are not alone. Gracias. Kamasamida.
Thank you, Board Member Garcia. Thank you for your words and your inspiration. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Board Member Jackie Goldberg, representing Board District 5. Thank you for being with us today, Board Member Goldberg. The floor is yours. Okay, I think there might have been a little bit of technical difficulties there. So at this point, while we resolve the technical difficulties, I'm going to now introduce, oh, I think we're here. Is she here? I'm going to now introduce Dr. Bianchi Tayama, who is here to introduce our guest speaker today. Dr. Bianchi Tayama, the floor is yours. Thank you for your leadership.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Chie-Bian Kitayama, Community of Schools Administrator for Koreatown Pico Union Community of Schools. It is my honor and great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ruth Chung. Dr. Ruth Chung is a professor of counseling psychology at University of Southern California, where she teaches and directs the marriage and family therapy program. Her areas of research and clinical expertise are in Asian American immigrant families and bicultural identity development of immigrant youth. She's a recipient of a Fulbright Award to Korea and has conducted research on the Korean American community for the Korean government. Dr. Chung, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction and also the invitation to be part of this very important time. I also just want to express my appreciation for the support and of solidarity for the AAPI community. As a member of that community and being so heartbroken by the ongoing violence and senseless violence, especially directed towards the most vulnerable members of our community, it is so critical and so important to be in support of one another. So I'm particularly appreciative of the support and solidarity that has been expressed by leaders of the LAUSD and of the board. So I have a fairly ambitious agenda as the first in a series that I'm aware of to celebrate Asian and Pacific American Heritage Month. I did want to start out by providing kind of an overview and a context of the Asian American community and its history, and then go specifically into Korean American history, and then conclude with some thoughts and suggestions on how we all together can address anti-violence and to really better understand the factors that are going into the recent rise in anti-Asian hate. So by the numbers, there are over 17 million Asian Americans in the United States. In total, we comprise about 6% of the total US population. That may seem kind of small, but that's because we're here in California and we're here in LA, where in California, we're over 10% of the total state population. But nationwide, we are in total about 6%. However, we're one of the fastest growing racial ethnic minority groups and saw the largest increase between 2000 and 2010 census. As a whole, we are first generation. Over half, about 66% of the total Asian American community is first generation. And there's always a little bit of confusion or disagreement about how we count the generations. But basically, we count first generation as those who are the first to come over. So we typically define define them as foreign born. And then the second generation starts the first group of generation that are actually born here in the United States. So you can see that 66% are first generation, but that's very quickly shifting to more of a native born Asian American population overall. So you can see in terms of kind of the bar chart that gives you a little bit of a sense of where we are in terms of how it's counted. And so the census counts folks a little bit differently in terms of those who are recognizing multiracial individuals. And so this just gives you a little bit of overview of how US Census counts them, which is a little bit higher because of the counting of multiracial individuals. For a more visual graphic of the concentration of Asians in the United States based on the 2010 census, again, where you see the dark shading is where you will see the highest concentration of Asians in the United States. What may be of surprise is that Asian Americans as a whole are actually overtaking or have overtaken Hispanics as in terms of number of those who are arriving as actual immigrants. And of course, this doesn't include undocumented folks, which might alter this graph a bit. But in terms of actual immigration into the United States, Asian Americans have overtaken Hispanics as the single largest group. You'll also see in terms of the ethnic breakdown, which are the largest groups. And so if you combine Chinese, including those from Hong Kong, but not including those from Taiwan, they're one of the largest groups. And if you were to include Taiwanese, they would probably be considered the largest single ethnic group. Those from South Asia, India comprise another large group, as well as the Philippines. And you'll see that Koreans and Vietnamese occupy a similar kind of numbers, and Koreans occupy, they're about 10% of the total Asian American population and fifth largest among the Asian American group. So again, being in Los Angeles, it may seem like the Korean American community is much larger in proportion to other groups, but overall, when we look at Asians in the United States as a whole, Korean Americans are the fifth largest group. But in terms of a specific ethnic group continuing to immigrate to the United States, Koreans are actually the third single largest group. So there continues to be significant immigration into the United States from Korea. And the history of Korean immigration really dates back to 1903. And I'm going to go back and talk about that a little bit more. But first, a few more numbers. Probably doesn't surprise you that California has the largest numbers and concentration of of Korean Americans. And you can see where the other states are. In recent decades, there's been more of an influx into the South, in particular Georgia, Atlanta area. And this is where we saw one of the most recent acts of tragedy and violence was in the Atlanta area, where there is a growing Korean American community. If you look at Southern California, again, the darker the shading, the greater the concentration of Koreans within the Southern California area. And you can see the Koreatown area, as well as Fullerton, Cerritos, and Diamond Bar area having some of the highest concentrations of Korean Americans here in Southern California. So with just kind of that demographic kind of, Asian American and Korean American community by the numbers, I really think that it's important to have some sense of the history of Asian migration to the United States. And then as a subset of that, how Korean American history and migration pattern in some ways is similar to other Asian immigration, as well as other non-Asian European immigration. What are some common features and what are some unique features? And I think in the interplay and comparison between the similarities and differences, we'll have a much richer and fuller understanding of the role of immigration, why people immigrate, why Asians immigrated, what were their early experiences like, what's unique to the Korean American experience, and how does all of that shape then contemporary Asian American and Korean American experience, because it's all interrelated and connected. So if you think about migration, if you, and perhaps you yourselves are immigrants or have migrated from another country, and so perhaps you can understand the dynamics that go into why would someone leave everything that is familiar and comfortable. Think about that. Especially if you're not familiar with the experience of migration, then think about why would you leave everything that is familiar and comfortable, your language, your culture, your foods, your relatives, and everything that is familiar to go to another country, sometimes at great risk, at great expense, at great cost. Now, if not physical and if not economic, then individually. Why would a family or individual be motivated to do that? Well, clearly it would be under some extraordinary circumstances. Migration is not something that we just feel like, oh, you know, then maybe I'll just go. It's not going on vacation. There's tremendous costs that are associated with that. So when we look at social scientists who look at migration of people across national borders, we identify two main forces, and we call them simply push-pull factors. So push factors are those circumstances and conditions within their home country that for whatever reason make it difficult for people to live and thrive. And their sense of the future is not so hopeful. And that's what that prompts them to basically make that sacrifice and motivates them to leave their comfort and their country and their culture of origin. So typically that's for economic difficulties. Oftentimes it's political instability, desire for religious freedom, any number of factors, but these are some of the most common push factors. But that's only half of the equation. So you may be motivated to leave, but where you end up is the other part of the equation, because in theory, once you leave, you can go anywhere in the globe, but in reality, that is not the case. Oftentimes, so we call the other part of that equation pull factors. What draws immigrants? What draws those who leave their countries of origin to seek opportunities in a particular country? And that has to do with pull factors. Obviously, immigration policies play a big role. Economic opportunities play a big role. I remember a number of years ago, my family we were in Europe, in England, and we were about to take the train to go to France. And what had happened was that the tunnel that connects France from England was blocked because a number of immigrants who were in France had attempted a very bold move. There were like about 67 or 80 folks who basically were risking quite a bit of, physical harm to actually traverse the entire length of the tunnel to go from France to England. And so that really illustrates this notion that while as Americans we think Europe is Europe, in reality, not all countries in Europe afford the same kind of opportunities and benefits, and which is the reason why these immigrants who are already in France were that desperate and motivated to go to that lengths to try to enter England. So these speak to pull factors. So when we think about migration, again, we need to understand the forces that drive and motivate people to leave their country and also to attempt entry into another country. So with that broader kind of framework in mind, we can understand and look at Asian migration to the US in two waves. The first wave spans a much longer period of time, but it was, you'll see in a minute, that not that many people were able to come. So the first wave begins in 1849 with the Chinese and the discovery of gold in California. And so even as far away as China, and at that time, it was quite a long distance away, they heard these fantastic stories of gold that was so plentiful that it was just hanging around for people to come. And all you had to do was come and just pick it up. And you know how these lore gets kind of exaggerated. And so actually the Chinese word for California is Gumsan, which literally translates into Gold Mountain. So that was what brought the Chinese, who were the first Asians to come to the United States, was the gold rush. But technically, we can't call them immigrants, because technically, initially, they were sojourners, meaning it was not their intent to stay here and make this their permanent home. Their intent was to make their fortune in gold and go back home and enrich not only themselves, but their family members. But reality was such that they experienced severe discrimination and exclusion, and they weren't able to make their fortunes in gold, and they weren't able to return to their homeland. And therefore, then by default, they ended up becoming kind of permanent residents and eventually citizens of the United States. Other groups who came after the Chinese were engaged in more of a two-step process, because the gold rush was a very short, kind of a lived pull factor. So most of other Asian migration was a two-step process, where they first went to Hawaii, where there was a need for labor to work in the sugarcane fields. And then from there, many of them came over into the mainland, and they engaged in mostly agriculture. So at first, given the cost of coming over to the United States from different Asian countries, both in terms of the danger and the distance and the economic cost, typically families pool their resources together, even sold off parts of ancestral land to invest in one of their members. And so clearly, if they were going to go to that lengths, it was not going to be women, but it was mostly young men. And again, the thought was that they would endure the difficulty, but bring home the wealth to be able to. So it was really an investment by an entire family network. But really, the Asian migration, you can see in this kind of simple graphic, that it didn't become very big. It really isn't until 1965, and I'm going to talk about why that's so critical. But you'll see this first wave, an initial wave where different groups came, but then it really flattened and plateaued out. And the reason why is that from the very beginning, you know, Chinese start to come in 1849 in trickle, and it starts to grow. But by 1875, we as a nation began to enact immigration ban. And the first of these was very interesting. It was called the Page Act of 1875, and it particularly targeted Chinese women, claiming that all Chinese women who were entering into the United States were intended for immoral purposes. And so the sexualization of Asian women is not just something that happened by the gunman when he shot all those victims as part of the Asian spa, and claiming that he was trying basically to rid our society of those evil temptresses that were responsible for his sexual addiction. That the sexualization of Asian American women was from the very, very beginning. So it's really powerful and important to understand the connections between the past and the present. And of course, this was a guise, this was an excuse from preventing women from entering into the United States, because again, given that they were mostly a bachelor society, if you kept the women out, that was really one of the most effective ways of doing population control. So this was the first of many immigration bans. But one of the most powerful ones and most historically kind of known ones is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which made no pretense. It didn't even bother with this idea of immoral purposes. It basically said anyone who is from China is really not welcome for entering into the United States. So this really challenges our idealized notion of, Statue of Liberty. And it is not by accident that Statue of Liberty is facing Europe. And this is exactly what we mean by a Eurocentric bias that we have in our society. When it comes to immigration from Asia, what we have in reality, in contrast, in opposition to Lady Liberty, is Angel Island, which sits in the middle of San Francisco Harbor, where Chinese who came were first taken to that detention center and they were interrogated with unreasonable questions to demonstrate and prove that whoever family member had sponsored their immigration to the United States was indeed their family member. So Angel Island facing Asia, in contrast to Ellis Island and Lady Liberty facing Europe. Other groups experienced similar types of exclusion. For Japanese Americans, it was called the Japanese Gentleman's Agreement. For other groups, I don't have time to go into that, but every single group that started to immigrate from Asia, very quickly, once they reached a certain visible number, there were acts and immigration laws that were passed to prevent them from being able to enter into the United States. Those who were already here then and who couldn't go back and who chose to also make this their permanent home experienced tremendous discrimination and violence, both legal as well as illegal. Alien land law in particular basically banned anyone who was not a US citizen from being able to own land. And while on the surface, that doesn't seem necessarily discriminatory, it was really targeting Japanese Americans who went into agriculture and later on Korean Americans who also went into agriculture. And it was a way of preventing them from having a livelihood, especially when the Asian American community took land in Central Valley that no one wanted, kind of barren, near barren, arid land, and engaged, they brought their farming practices, intensive irrigation practices, and then they churned kind of undesirable land into very fertile and productive farming land. But unfortunately, this created a lot of backlash and resentment that contributed to a large measure, again, in discrimination against Japanese Americans in World War II and their incarceration in what are called America's concentration camps. There were acts of extreme violence, again, too many to go over, but just a few notable ones was in Rock Springs, Wyoming, where there was a mining camp, and there were Chinese miners as well as other European immigrant miners. But these white European immigrant miners felt more entitled to this place than these Chinese immigrant miners. And so they, at the end of this massacre, 28 people, Chinese miners were dead, and 78 Chinese homes were burned. And there are historic and accounts as well as depictions where you have, these Chinese mining barracks are burned down. And as people are fleeing, the white miners standing in the periphery with shotguns and picking them off as people are escaping. But as terrible as that is, one of the darkest and one of the most horrific acts of violence against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans was right here in our own front yard. And this was the LA Chinatown Massacre of 1871, where based on an unfounded rumor that a policeman had been killed in some kind of a gang shootout, 500 residents of LA descended on Chinatown. And at the end of this massacre, 19 Chinese Americans were killed, including 15 who were lynched. In the aftermath, 10 of these folks who engaged in these acts of violence and inhumanity were prosecuted. 8 of them were convicted. But much like Vincent Chen's case, where a young Chinese-American male was hunted down and killed by 2 laid-off Detroit auto workers in the mid-'80s, who were also convicted, but later they were able to go without any kind of sentence served. So again, these acts of violence is not unique to current, now, and today. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of this to kind of get to what marks the second wave of Asian migration. Is that, as you saw with the numbers, you see that, Asian migration kind of started and it really peters out and it really is quite flat. And it isn't until World War II that things start to pick up a little bit for the Asian American community and they began to grow. But it isn't until 1965 with the Immigration Reform Act that the Asian American community really grows. And it was under Lyndon B. Johnson administration with Robert Kennedy kind of spearheading this kind of humanitarian reform to our outdated and racist immigration policies. And it basically abolished these immigration policy based on where you're coming from and how many people could enter based on where you're coming from, to allow a more of a criteria. So the first criteria that would give you preference for being able to enter into the United States is that if you had family members here and you have family members who were separated, that gave them first priority basically to line up to be able to enter into the United States. Then after that were people who were professionals. So if you were a professional like a doctor or a dentist or a nurse or a CPA, then you also got to kind of move up to the front of the line to be able to enter into the United States, as well as if you were in a field where there was a clearly identified labor shortage, that also gave you preference for being able to enter into the United States. Now, mind you, when this Immigration Reform Act was passed, there was some concern about Asian migration, but they really didn't imagine that it would open the floodgates of immigration from Asia in the way that it did. If they knew, if they had anticipated, it probably would not have passed. But whether it was knowing or not, the 1965 Immigration Reform Act is what is largely responsible for the current configuration of the Asian American community. So you can see in this graphic that if you look at 1860s early on, and you see the dark shading, most of the immigration is coming from Europe. And then you see this precipitous drop. And those of you who are old enough may recognize that was the Great Depression. And so when our nation is struggling, we were not in the mood to be accepting immigrants from anywhere else, regardless of where they were coming from. And so there was a precipitous decline in immigration as a result of the Great Depression. But then you see the uptick in 1940s. And again, this is after World War II. And then you see this as it kind of stratospheric increase in immigration. And you see this very large proportion of immigration coming from Asia, as well as Latin America, as well as Africa, and a diverse group of others. But you also see that immigration from Europe really declines post-1965 in relation to other groups. If you look specifically at migration among Asian American groups, again, you see in the early 1900s that it's mostly Japanese and Chinese, and all other Asian groups representing a much smaller proportion, but how those dynamics shift. And so by 1970, you really start to see a very big decrease in immigration from Japan, as well as China, but these all other Asian American group really increases. And this is where Korean Americans come in. So Korean migration is very interesting and short-lived. In this first wave, it's only occurs in literally, that's not a typo. It happens in about 2 to 3 years. And it's because just as Koreans start to come to the United States, Japan takes over Korea and basically colonizes Korea and therefore stops Korean migration to the US. So in this small window of opportunity where Koreans come, it's about 7,000 in total, and they go mainly to Hawaii and then to California. But what's also kind of interesting and very unique to the Korean experience, and if any of you have any experience with the Korean American community or drive around where there's a high concentration of Koreans, what you might have also noticed is the number of churches. And this is not a stereotype, it is not a fluke, it is actually a historically based reality. Korean migration has been very much shaped by Christianity in that first wave. For a number of historical reasons, Koreans adopted Christianity more so than other immigrant groups. And because they faced persecution in their country, many of them were motivated to immigrate as intact families. And so a large proportion of this first wave of Koreans, this 5,000 to 6,000 to 7,000, most of them were families, and most of them were Korean, and most of them went to Hawaii initially. But again, it was a very small community, but 95% of the current Korean American community came after 1965, and that would be my family included. We were at the very early end of that Korean migration. I came here in 1970. So 95% of the current Korean community came post-1965. Korean migration peaks in the mid-80s, and then it declines. Why? Because Korea becomes an economic power. Quality of life in Korea gets better, so people are less motivated to move to the United States. But then it starts to rise again in the 1990s. And Christianity continues to be a major role in not only people wanting to migrate, but after they migrate, especially in the post-1965, it's more that once you come here, one of the best ways for you to be able to adapt and have a social support network to help you navigate immigration and adaptation was through the churches. And so whether the first wave or the second wave, churches played an absolutely critical role within the Korean American experience. And I would say that is one of the unique features of the Korean American experience. So here again, you see the numbers, you see the 1965, it increases, and about mid-1980s, it kind of tops off, and then it declines, and you start to see the increase of Korean migration starting in the 1990s. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip through some of this, but basically, there aren't that many Christians in Korea. It's about 20% but you would see that Koreans in the United States range from about 65% all the way up to 70% in different studies that show that Koreans in the United States who identify as Christian, and they're also very devout Christians by the number of times that they attend. So just kind of wrapping up why are Koreans immigrating to the United States, when it's an economic powerhouse, and but basically what's happening now in the recent increase of Korean migration is that as much as Korea has developed into this economic powerhouse, in many ways it's still a very difficult place to live. As perceived by parents, because the educational opportunities are extremely competitive. So if you can imagine if the standard is that everyone is trying to get into Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, like literally every single high school student aspires to get into those 3 schools, you can imagine how competitive and challenging that would be. And so in this new wave of migration, it has a lot to do with kind of the pressures and the competition for economic opportunities. Not that they're not there, but that the competition for the good life is so extreme that many of these parents who are themselves well accomplished and educated are perhaps motivated to come to the United States to provide more opportunities and more openness for their children. And because of this kind of pressure, there's a lot of quality of life issues in Korea. Studies that have looked at developed countries, it's the lowest among the top 17. Korea consistently has one of the highest rates of suicide in young men, in particular between ages 18 to 25. They have to spend extreme amount of time going to cram schools above and beyond regular school. And so altogether, that kind of emotional psychological pressure for success is so heavy and burdensome that this is one of the main reasons why Korean migration to the United States is increasing. And I just want to end with really talking about the role that the model minority stereotype and the burden that this has placed on the Asian American community. And you see here in this visual kind of the image of Asian Americans before 1965, in this early period, the way that Chinese are depicted as yellow peril, aliens unfit for assimilation. And then you have post-1965 with Asian Americans being portrayed as a model minority. That it's really in this combination that has really contributed to the violence and the invisibility of the Korean American community. And so the rise of anti-Asian violence in LA in particular, it has doubled from last year. So LA Times recently reported that reported acts of crimes and violence against the AAPI community has doubled exactly from a year ago. A Pew studies indicates that 81% of AAPI say the violence against them is increasing, and that almost half of AAPIs have indicated that they've experienced at least one act of hate during the pandemic. So what a part of the complexity and the challenge of the Asian American community is that we live between these two extremes of, on one hand, being seen as perpetual foreigners, that even if you're fourth and fifth generation Chinese and Japanese Americans, because of the way that they look, they're always seen as and treated as foreigner, and hence asked the question, where are you from? Or when Michelle Kwan lost her gold medal to a fellow American, Tara Lipinski, MSNBC headline reads, "American beats out Kwan." Even though Kwan was the kind of seen as the darling of the American figure skating team, again, for that hard work ethic and a representation of that American dream. But when push came to shove, race wins out over, and Kwan, who is seen in that way, gets labeled as not an American for the obvious and only reason that she doesn't have the white face to go with this perceived notion that to be American is to be white. I want to end with this, and I'm sorry that I have so much that I want to share that I know I'm a little bit over time, but I want you to look at this quote because I think it's very relevant. So this is a quote by a very famous person. It is a political figure, and he's talking about, in a letter to a friend, these people. He's complaining about these people. So I'll read the quote. He had misgivings about these people because of their clannishness, their little knowledge of English, their own ethnic press, and the increasing need of interpreters. He was not for refusing them admission entirely, that is, into this country, but he did urge better distribution and more mixture, meaning that they should mingle. So just very briefly in your own head, take a guess. Who might this famous political figure be? And who might be those people or these people that he might be complaining about for their self-segregation and their own ethnic enclaves? You have your guesses in mind? What do you think about this? It was Benjamin Franklin, and he was complaining about those pesky Germans who were refusing to integrate and assimilate, who were holding on to their culture of origin, especially in holding on to their native language with their own ethnic presses and the need for interpreters. I hope that that this gives us a different perspective, a more realistic perspectives, that the struggles and issues of what we're talking is not just about Asians or for Latinos but we as a nation, we've always been a nation of immigrants. We have always been a nation of immigrants. And every single immigrant group that has come to these shores has desperately tried to hold on to its culture and tradition and its language, even as the next generation is loosening that grip and trying to become as American as possible. This might be another graphic that might be of interest to you. This is not back in 1900s or even 1950s. This is now. And right now, this is the linguistic map of America. It speaks to the most common language by state other than English or Spanish. This is America. We are a nation of immigrants. We are a multilingual, we are a multicultural society. And this is what makes us great as a nation. Not trying to revert back to some unfounded, idealistic, one that never existed. But the reality of America is that we have always been a nation of immigrants. And it is because of our immigrants, both in the past and those who continue to come to these shores, that makes our nation great. And you don't have to go anywhere further than the Olympic team that you're going to see this summer. That speaks in the most clearest and simplest and most powerful testimony to the greatness of our nation being based in our immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants, and it is that diversity that makes us great. And so diversity isn't just something to be tolerated, it is something to be celebrated. And yes, it is not easy. It is not easy to deal with diversity and differences, but that is a challenge that we must continue to embrace and work through and create an equitable and just society for everyone. And I just wanted to provide a little bit of that historic context as we began the series in celebration of the AAPI heritage. And I really hope that you, on your own, rather than me telling you about the contributions of Asian Americans who have come to these shores, that you would take it upon yourselves to learn and to find out about that history, to be able to celebrate and to understand the contributions that Asians, Americans have made to the American landscape. So thank you so much for your time and attention. And I think if there's time, perhaps questions.
So absolutely, we will have some time. We have a little bit of time for Q&A. Thank you so much for that historical overview and important, highlighting the important contributions that Asian Americans have made. And before we go into our Q&A, I would like to introduce our board member, Mrs. Jackie Goldberg. I know we had a little bit of connectivity issues. Ms. Goldberg, would you like to share some words?
Well, first of all, let me say to Dr. Chung that was a wonderful presentation, and I hope you'll make your slides available to all of us because I'd like to read them again and again. And let me also thank all of you for joining us because I think it's very important that we show up for each other. That's the key. The key is to not be silent, to not watch something bad happen and say, oh, I don't want to get involved. You see discrimination, you see racism, stand up and speak up. You don't have to be hostile about it, but you can say, don't say that around me. I don't want to hear that, or that's just not true. Why would you say something like that when you don't know that that's true? There are all kinds of ways to stand up, but a lot of people expect us, if we're not Asian Pacific Islander, to say nothing when we see it, when we hear it. And that's really our responsibility as human beings and as Americans, to stand up for each other and to say for each other, I am with you, I am your ally, I support you. Anybody who discriminates against you, calls you names, attacks you, if I'm around, I'm going to do something about it. because that is how you stop this kind of bad behavior and these racist things and the ways that people, I was shocked, probably the most shocked by the fact that in one incident of New York of people being Asian Pacific women being attacked, that people did not stop to help. That tells you everything. That tells you everything. We need to stand up for each other. So thank you, all of you in Local District Central, for putting on this event. I look forward to the others, but I really do want to just end by saying thank you, Dr. Chung. I thought the presentation was wonderful, and I do want a copy of your slides if I can. Thank you all very much for letting me say a few words at the end, and I'm sorry I got completely disconnected, literally at the beginning.
Thank you, Ms. Goldberg, Board Member Goldberg, for your words. I think you answered part of one of our questions, and we're going to pose it to our panelists that are here today, our panelists and others that are with us today. But really, it's about one of the questions is, what can we actually do as a community to end racism, acts of hate and violence against Asians and others, including Latinos in our community? So Board Member Goldberg described some of the things we can do that sound very reasonable and all of us can do. Dr. Chung, do you have any other comments or ideas about what else we can do?
Yes, I do. I had it, and I'm willing to share. Be glad to share those resources and handouts related to that. Just because of the time, and I was so eager to share the historical information that I didn't include that, but it is shared with the team. But I think, as Jackie said, it really is standing up, and there's formal training for bystander training where you can learn to be an effective ally. So I would say that that's one of the ways. Again, echoing what Jackie said earlier, is speaking out. And so if you yourself have ever been a victim of such an act, even if it's small, report it. We have, if it doesn't get counted and reported, we can't track it. We can't really, say this really, so we need the data. So I would say definitely report it. Definitely be an advocate and an ally, and there's formal trainings related to that. I would say also donate to key organizations. One of the key organizations, very easy to remember, is Anti-Asian Hate. Has become kind of a spokesman, kind of a group for the API community in the way that Black Lives Matter has become kind of the focal point for advocacy for the African American community. So those are, and then I would say get educated. I think it's so important to get educated and to really understand. And finally, part of that education, and I challenge this to our own AAPI community, is to understand the commonalities of our experience with other communities of color, because unfortunately, one of the things that has happened with the model minority image is that we have been used as a tool as infighting and as to put down other racial minority groups, and that it has really served to maintain the power and privilege of the white dominant group. Because the model minority essentially basically says, why can't you folks over here, especially during the civil rights movement and activities, was really a counter to that, to take these Asians who had pretty much been ignored up until that time, to now lift them up and to say, oh, look at these minority, they're racial, they've been discriminated, but you don't see them out there protesting and fighting for their civil rights. They're just quietly going about doing their business. And look, they keep their head down and they study and work out, and look where they got. And so it was really a very intentional use of divide and conquer by the dominant group to really pit groups against each other. And unfortunately, many Asian Americans within our community have kind of been co-opted and have bought into this narrative. And so we don't really see our commonalities with other communities of color. So I think that it's important as much for us to educate within the Asian American community, as well as to educate and connect with other communities of color.
Thank you for that response. Also, we have another question. I think you partially answered it already about the many resources that are available for us to kind of have more of an awareness. The question is also includes, do you have specific resources that address the Korean American experience specific to Los Angeles, or also any authors, films, or documentaries you might recommend?
Oh, absolutely. I'm so glad. There are many community-based organizations in LA who are great resources. KYCC is one of them. Even though their services, it's Korean youth and family services, but they have really expanded beyond just Korean American community to serve largely the Latino population in Los Angeles as well. But that would be one great Korean youth and family services. Yes, thank you. Korean American family services focusing specifically on advocating for women, especially those who are victims of domestic violence. So there are a number of very active and powerful organizations within LA that serve those communities. In terms of documentary, just today, earlier today, PBS is re-airing its series on Asian Americans, and it's a PBS series that was developed. It's an excellent series, and I think that's one of the best and the most engaging overviews. I must make a little plug and say that my husband, who is a U.S. historian who is at UCLA, my arch nemesis over there on the other side of LA, was one of the historical kind of technical consultants on that particular documentary series, and it's probably one of the best right now. And it's very engaging and easy to, so you can watch with your kids or show it in classes. So I would definitely point to that as an excellent resource, the PBS series on Asian Americans.
Thank you so much. So we know there's many resources that are available to our community. And lastly, I just want to leave you with a couple of the commentary that are here. So first of all, folks are very thankful for your historical overview and for a wonderful presentation. Also a comment around the importance of getting to know each other's cultures, so we can have less discrimination out there. And so these are just some of the comments that are coming out, but absolutely very positive comments, a great historical perspective, and also resources that you've shared with us today. So with that, I want to thank you, Dr. Chung, and hand it back to Mr. Spicer.
I have to agree. I'm in awe. Thank you so much, Dr. Chung. It's been an absolute pleasure to just listen to you today, listen and learn. And I'm going to do exactly what you said. I'm going to learn more because I want to always be a learner, but also going back and sharing with my family and those who are close to me some of the nuggets that you taught us. Very, very, very grateful for you and your time today. With that, I also want to thank all of our participants that came to us today so that we could recognize, celebrate, but also stand in solidarity with our Korean American communities, continuing the work of equity and social justice here in Local District Central, the home of the champions. I look forward to seeing you all at our next town hall, actually, which is next week, Black Students Matter. And you will be seeing that correspondence coming to you soon. But the next piece of this series, of course, will be a week from then, May 20th at 5 o'clock. And look forward to that. And that is going to be our Filipino American families, communities, excuse me. So look forward to that. And we look forward to having you with us. So with that, I want to tell you, be safe. Follow us on all of your social media outlets, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for coming.